Louis Buchalter managed to go from an ordinary guy who was hired to beat someone up to becoming a man to whom entire industries were subordinated. Under his patronage worked a gang, which received for its bloodthirstiness the name Murder Incorporated. And Lepke himself was labeled public enemy #1 by the FBI. So if you're interested in hearing the story of the bloodiest and most successful racketeer of the early 20th century, then meet Louis Lepke Buchalter on the other side of the law. I want to ask you to take your mind off the video for a moment and look at this cool print I made for you. If you like it, you can buy any product you like by clicking the link in the description. And of course, every item you purchase contributes to the growth and advancement of the channel. Thank you for your attention, and now let's dive deeper into the story of our hero for today. Louis Buchalter was born in New York City in February 1897. He was the youngest in a family of 7 children, according to some accounts, according to others of 11. His parents, Rose and Barnett, were both Jewish immigrants who both came to the States with their first spouses and both lost them there. So their union was already a blend of 2 families with children, which was then only to be enhanced by new additions. Under the circumstances, the Buchalters had little time to raise their children. All their energy was spent on providing for them, and the offspring were left to fend for themselves most of the time. But even under such circumstances, little Louis did not show the slightest hint of deviant behavior. Surrounding adults considered him a shy boy, which would turn out to be a decent member of American society. However, the guise under which he would go down in history gradually made its way into the light. In 1912, he was arrested for participation in a mass brawl, and his mother began to hear rumors that her beloved Lepke, as she called him, was engaged in theft and robbery. She either couldn't or didn't want to correct him at the time. By then, Barnett had passed away, and Rose was single-handedly looking after Louis. Most of her time was still spent trying to earn a living rather than raising her son, so turning a blind eye to the fact that he'd gotten into a fight with someone or taken something from someone else was easier than trying to constantly counsel him. Besides, back then, this kind of teenage behavior was not out of the ordinary. Many people in immigrant communities grew up the same way, and that didn't mean that they were bound to become gangsters for life. And Rose had proof for her suppositions. At the age of 15, and by this time a high school dropout, Louis took a job as a legal messenger for $3 a week, giving most of his earnings to his mother. However, the underworld continued to suck the young Buchalter in, and his mother had no idea how deep. Theft and robbery did not leave his life, and added to it were trips to bars and pool halls, where he got acquainted with local characters from the other side of the law. And one such character, named Jacob Gura Shapiro, would later become his partner in everything for many years. It was his acquaintance with him that marked Lepke's plunge into racketeering. Together with Shapiro, they organized a small gang and terrorized the local street vendors. They demanded protection money, and if refused, they smashed up their shop, doing it for as many days as it took for the vendor to start paying. In addition to this, they also practiced burglary, for which Louis was arrested 3 times between 1915 and 1916. He spent just over a year in prison and was released in the summer of 1917. Not 6 months later, however, Buchalter was again jailed on the same charge. In January 1918, he received a 1.5-year sentence in Sing Sing prison. In 1919, he was released, and in 1920, he went to jail again, seeing freedom again only in March 1922. And from then until the late 1930s, Buchalter never again looked at the prison walls from the inside, although arrests would still be an almost regular occurrence in his life. When Louis was released from prison again, it turned out that the world hadn't changed all that significantly, albeit slightly with the introduction of prohibition. There were underground distilleries everywhere. His peers were making good money bootlegging, and the penalties for this activity were laughable. However, Buchalter chose a different path. Whether he knew then that it would bring him a lot of money, or whether he simply followed the beaten path, it didn't matter much, because in both cases in 1922, he began his career as a labor racketeer, which would give him everything he could dream of, while destroying hundreds of people's lives. Before we begin the story of Buchalter's rise as a labor racketeer, it is worth first telling you how labor racketeering came to be in the States in the first place, so that you have a better idea of Lepke's role in the history of this illegal way of making money. I've already touched on this topic superficially on my channel in the video about Arnold Rothstein. However, now we need to dive a little deeper. Labor racketeering started at the end of the 19th century. At that time, there was a mass migration of Jews from Eastern Europe, who in large numbers went to work in the garment industry. Such a large influx of cheap labor unleashed the hands of employers who drove their workers into inhumane conditions. Because of this, more and more labor unions began to appear, fighting for decent working conditions and wages. If the unions could not reach an agreement, they led the workers to strike. That's where the gangsters came in. First hired by employers to break up the picket lines, and then by the labor unions to resist the violent suppression of strikes and protect their leaders and workers. That is to say, at first, the gangsters were simply hired as fighters for a fixed fee, and initially they were content with this role. The first known mercenary of this kind was Monk Eastman. In the late 19th century, he led the strongest group of gangsters on par with the Gang of Five Corners. He sided with employers in the labor wars and broke up demonstrations from 1897 to 1904. However, he did not take this way of making money seriously and didn't place any bets on it. The next gangster, who already saw opportunities in labor racketeering, was Jack Zelig. In 1908, he led the former Eastman gang and took advantage of the mass strike in 1909 to infiltrate the trade union movement. That strike of 20,000 women from the garment industry lasted 6 months, and Zelig and his thugs were on the side of the workers. Eventually, at the end of the strike, he joined several labor unions and received a steady paycheck for himself and his fighters. In 1912, Zelig was murdered, and his work was continued by Benny Fain, who further increased the presence of gangsters in the labor movement. Records have been preserved showing how much Fain was paid for his law enforcement services. $50 a week was paid to him personally, and another $10 for each of his men, from which Benny pocketed another $2. Services beyond simple beatings were paid for separately, so a broken limb costed $200, and murder $500 per person. When faced with prison time, or worse, the death penalty, Fain made a deal with the authorities. His place was taken by Jacob Organ, nicknamed Little Augie. Organ continued the policy of his predecessors: beat faces, get money, and when in 1924 he was set up with the communists by Arnold Rothstein, Augie didn't ask too many questions. He didn't care that the communists wanted to take over the labor unions to influence revolutionary sentiment. He didn't care that Rothstein was milking those very communists, giving the gangsters he could influence not only them but the industrialists as well, allowing him to manage the strikes as he needed to. Organ was just doing what he knew how to do, hitting people and getting a quick paycheck. And when Lepke and Shapiro tried to tell him that they themselves had the power to take over the unions, the power to manage the strikes themselves, and thus influence the producers, getting much more from them than they do now, Augie said that he was not interested. This was the basis for the conflict between Organ and Shapiro and Buchalter, who had gained weight in the gang by the end of the 1920s. The latter understood how to act in order to ensure a secure old age, and Augie was an obstacle in their way. The occasion for the conflict to become active was another strike in which the gang participated. With Organ as boss, they agreed to end the strike by paying him $50,000. Buchalter opposed it, operating to the point that by continuing it would be possible to hammer out much better terms. Augie, of course, refused, because of which Lepke and Shapiro broke away from the group, taking their loyalists with them. Organ teamed up with the notorious Prohibition-era gangsters, the Diamond Brothers, to strengthen his position. However, this did not help him either. In October 1927, Buchalter and Shapiro tracked down and killed Augie. Jack Diamond, who was with him that night, survived the assassination attempt but refused to confront Lepke. Thus, Buchalter got rid of the last competitors in that area of labor racketeering in the garment industry, which was dominated by Jewish gangsters. Because you have to realize that even though Lepke was probably the biggest racketeer in that period, the Italian mobsters were not sleeping. And if Louis was raiding areas where Jews were predominant, the Mafia was raiding areas where there were more Italian immigrants. And this is basically very typical of the National Crime Syndicate, which was formed of first and second generation immigrants. Now, Buchalter could do business the way he had long wanted to. He started with the garment industry, as he knew it well. The unions, accustomed to gangsters sitting on their paychecks and keeping a low profile outside of strikes, were unprepared for the fact that they would not just come out of the shadows, but would attack their former employers. Through threats and beatings, Buchalter, together with Shapiro, took control of one union after another. The scheme of the takeover was simple as hell. The union leader hired the Lepke gangsters to do the job. Whether it was a strike or suppression of internal dissent, it didn't matter. Louis asked, in addition to money for it, how many of his men would become members of the union. The work that Buchalter was hired to do was done to the best of his ability, the union leader satisfied. But only after a while, Lepke's men, with the same threats and beatings, organized a coup within the union and took it under their control. Well, after, Louis influenced the organization of strikes on manufacturers and extorted money from them in exchange for the peaceful operation of their factories. It worked the same way with the industrialists. Lepke was hired and did the job, but inside the factory his men remained, exercising control by the same means of threats and beatings, which allowed Louis to extort more money than ever. And if the functioning of the factory was not particularly important to him, Lepke maximally squeezed the credit line of the company, and when the owner could no longer pay the bills, he simply left him to deal with the bankruptcy, alone. In addition to manufacturing, Buchalter also took over transportation. Clothing then was not often sewn in one factory. Before ending up in the store, it passed through several hands. It was mostly transported by private contractors who were not affiliated with the factory. Lepke united most of these firms into one association, naturally under his control. After that, he could dictate his terms to dissenting factories by simply cutting off their logistical links. Of course, after such an association, transportation prices rose sharply, and all the unforeseen profits were taken by Buchalter and his partners. The only area in the garment industry where Louis could not penetrate was in the fur industry. There he was strongly rebuffed, so the gangster left him alone and turned his attention to controlling what had already been acquired, as well as scouting other potential areas, one of which eventually became the bakery industry. Lepke went in using an already proven method. He organized a single association of carriers from disparate firms, and then extorted money from industrialists through labor strikes. In addition to these spheres, Buchalter also penetrated into the unions of film operators, shoemakers, handbag manufacturers, cab drivers, poultry farmers, and after the death of Dutch Schultz, he took over part of the union of restaurant workers. He didn't do all these takeovers alone, of course. By the beginning of the 1930s, included in Buchalter and Shapiro's group was about 250 people, and the following years their numbers only grew. Some of these fighters would eventually become known as Murder Incorporated. Such a loud name for Buchalter's Brooklyn gang was invented, of course, by journalists. And then, on the basis of this name, there were so many rumors that the order of assassins from the game of the same name would nervously smoke on the side. For example, there were rumors that for new killers in the gang, invariably their first order received was to dispatch an older killer who had already managed to perform several hits, and thus the top got rid of a lot of knowledgeable people. The new hitman was subsequently eliminated in the same fashion. And in other rumors, these new killers were all descendants of local scum barely approaching 18 years old. Those who did the best job were not killed but transferred to the category of so-called professionals who sat on a permanent salary and carried out especially important orders. And who paid them for this? Right, the criminal syndicate headed by Luciano. The number of gangs varied from 500 to 1,500 people. The number of murders in all totaled less than 1,000 victims. It's just a great story for a cool action or detective movie, where the investigator catches the most dangerous gang in the world. However, the reality has always turned out to be much more prosaic. They did not sit on any salary from the crime syndicate, as there was no crime syndicate. Those who have been watching me for a long time already know why. For those who have been watching me for a long time already know why. For those who haven't, check out my video about the birth of the American Mafia. Actually, everything else has been greatly exaggerated. It was an ordinary gang, which, like others, engaged in racketeering, extortion, usury, prostitution, and other illegal activities. And as a secondary job, they did orders for Buchalter. Could they have committed murders for the mob? They could have. Louis knew Luciano, and he was on good terms with Anastasia, so getting them together wasn't a problem. The other thing is that they didn't kill on the level of modern drug cartels, and they were never a private army. It was a gang of ordinary thugs who eliminated dozens, maybe hundreds, but by no means thousands of people. But I digress. Murder Incorporated is a topic for a separate video, and for the context of Lepke's story, you should realize that he was connected to them. They were doing his bidding, and in the future they would be one of the reasons for his problems with the law. Now I propose we move on and talk about another illegal trade that the Jewish gangster had a hand in, namely drug trafficking. This story goes back to the 1920s, when a Jacob Katzenberg worked for Arnold Rothstein, managing the delivery of heroin from China to the States. In 1928, Rothstein died and Jacob began running the operation on his own. By 1935, however, either the channels through which he smuggled the product were cut off or some other problems prevented him from working. In general, Katzenberg came to Lepke and asked for help in organizing for the smooth receipt of goods on American soil. Buchalter agreed, but set on his own conditions. He put up no money but only solved problems. He got 50% of the wholesale heroin imports. The drugs were only sold to dealers Louis trusted, that is, those who worked for him in one way or another, and from them he gets 50% of the retail sales. Katzenberg, of course, puffed up at such demands, but to refuse one of the most influential gangsters of that time, especially when he himself came to him, was not only stupid but also dangerous. And Buchalter did solve the problems with customs and, without investing a dime, entered the heroin smuggling business. However, drugs, of course, were for him a kind of investment on par with the same legal investments he made for reports to the tax authorities. Labor racketeering remained his source of livelihood. No wonder, just think about it. He managed to take over an industry that in the 1930s produced about 500 million pieces of women's clothing and 250 million pieces of men's clothing a year. Don't forget that he had a presence in other areas as well, and then estimate how much money he could have made through extortion. Unfortunately, of course, no one gave us exact figures, and the FBI's calculations don't make it very clear either. They said after Lepke's conviction that he made between $2 and $50 million a year. But even if you take the minimum figure from that statement and convert it to the modern equivalent, you get more than $35 million, or almost $3 million monthly. On this money, Lepke could not deny himself anything. Travel to Europe, vacations at the best resorts in America, nice houses, cars, suits. He had a life he never dreamed of as a kid stealing purses. However, having climbed so high, Buchalter couldn't help but attract the attention of the authorities. Prosecutor Thomas Dewey had just about put underground lottery kingpin Dutch Schultz in jail. He put Charles Luciano away for running a prostitution ring, and decided his scalp collection was missing a prominent labor racketeer. So Lepke appeared on his radar, and he would soon forget what a quiet and contented life was all about. Buchalter's downfall began in 1936 when a labor racketeering case in the fur industry finally came to court. I've said before that this was the only area in the garment industry that Lepke was unable to take over. There, he got not only a forceful rebuff, but also a man who risked testifying against him. He didn't get punished in the end, managing to acquit himself in the appeals court, but what he did get was Dewey's undivided attention. The prosecutor had been developing a case against Lepke, but after the trial he finally realized that he could be another big fish for him. Dewey decided to focus on the acts Buchalter had committed in the baking industry. It started with the investigation into the murder of William Snyder, which took place in 1934. Snyder was then head of the Flour Carriers Association. Buchalter did not like him in this position, so on his orders, Snyder was murdered by the Goldust brothers, who then de facto headed it. However, as often happens in such cases, the witnesses who could be found refused to testify and the case fell apart. Did that stop Dewey? On the contrary, he got a clear signal of where to dig by beginning a thorough examination of the affairs of the Flour Transporters Association. Lepke immediately realized that the heat was on and went on the run, so that his place in the dock was empty. Instead, Max Silverman, William Goldust, and Benjamin Spivak were convicted of labor racketeering. All three, naturally, had worked for Buchalter. Lepke himself had a separate case in the same area in which Max Rubin, Buchalter's longtime right-hand man, who knew a lot, was already testifying. Plus, one of Katzenberg's men also sang, giving the Bureau of Narcotics the whole scheme of his operation, putting Buchalter in charge of it. And to make sure Louis didn't get away with it, Dewey nailed the Goldust brothers on the Snyder assassination attempt, and they broke, agreeing to testify about Lepke's dealings in the baking industry. With that set of charges, Buchalter could have well spent the rest of his life in prison, which he most likely did not want to do. He decided to solve this problem in the most typical way, very similar to the famous expression, no body, no case. Only in the case of Lepke, it sounds more like, no witness, no prosecution. The first thing to do with this strategy was to hide, so that the authorities would not find him before they ran out of living witnesses, which wasn't really the easiest task. Dewey put up a $25,000 bounty on his head, and Hoover promised the same amount on behalf of the FBI. And created in New York was a special task force, consisting of 50 people which dealt exclusively with the capture of Buchalter. And even in such conditions, Lepke managed for several years to successfully hide and run his empire, while eliminating all those who could denounce him in court. And on one hand, it did work. Dewey was very nervous about the fact that one by one people who could tell him anything about Buchalter's affairs were disappearing. He even called a private meeting about it where he discussed with the FBI and the DEA how to influence the situation. But on the other hand, because of this behavior by the boss, many subordinates began to fear for their lives. After all, the slightest suspicion was enough for Lepke to sentence a person to death, especially since there was already a precedent when Louis was wrong. Max Rubin, whom I've already mentioned, was sent away from New York by Buchalter. However, a couple weeks later, he disobeyed his boss and traveled back to see his family. At the same moment, he received a summons to report to Dewey for questioning. Rubin had no intention of complying. He wasn't going to snitch like that. Buchalter did not believe this and sent men to kill him. Max miraculously survived the assassination attempt and radically changed his mind about cooperating with the authorities, becoming a key witness in the racketeering case in the bakery industry. Another downside to this strategy was that it hurt the rest of the top of the underworld. New York's crime bosses, one way or another, had connections in the power structures. Such cooperation was mutually beneficial and allowed both sides to enrich themselves. However, when you have a hunt for public enemy number one, with whom you were basking in the Florida sun yesterday, the authorities are somehow less willing to make contact, fearing, among other things, that the hunt would affect them as well. So the other bosses, mostly from the Italian mafia, began to think about how to clean up this whole mess as quick as possible. And they decided that the best way was to hand Lepke over to the authorities. This option was also advantageous for them because it would be possible to divide his spheres of influence among themselves after Buchalter's condemnation. That is, as they say, to have your cake and eat it too. And in order that Lepke would not resist such a decision, they persuaded him through Albert and Anastasia, who helped Louis to hide. The surrender would take place according to a pre-agreed scenario. Buchalter would have to surrender in person into the hands of FBI Director Hoover and would receive a sentence of only drug trafficking and no more than 12 years. Lepke, who was facing many times that amount, agreed, and the mob actually arranged for him to surrender to Hoover personally. And on August 24, 1939, Anastasia took Louis to a meeting with the director of the FBI. After getting into the car, driving a few hundred meters, and having a few words with Hoover, Lepke realized that he was deceived. There was no deal, and whether the gangsters received the promise of $50,000 for the surrender of Buchalter is not known. The first case he was tried for was drug trafficking. It turned out so because Louis surrendered to the federal authorities, and the case of smuggling was also federal. Incidentally, in the future, the fact that he was first tried for heroin would very much jeopardize Dewey's enforcement of a conviction in a case he prosecuted. Katzenberg, who had suggested Lepke get into drug smuggling, was happy to testify in the case as a witness to get his own sentence commuted. Plus, it turned out that undercover agent Al Cairns was also among the smugglers. In general, Louis was there and it was impossible to turn away. In January 1941, he received 14 years in prison. Then, a couple of days later, he already had another court date, in which the prosecutor was Thomas Dewey. Lepke was on trial in New York for labor racketeering in the baking and clothing industries. Here, as in the drug case, his former associates testified against him, but did it not only for fear of spending a long time behind bars, but also for fear of being killed. For Lepke, their mere existence would seem burdensome, because even after his arrest, the deaths of undesirable people still continued. As a result, in March 1940, in a racketeering case, he received another 30 years in prison. As it turned out, however, the worst was just ahead. Abe Rellis, a hitman from the infamous Murder Incorporated, had talked to the authorities. Lepke knew that he could have said so much that the only feasible sentence for him would be the electric chair. However, for such a prediction to become true, the authorities needed to find evidence beyond Rellis's words, because in New York City you couldn't judge a man solely on the word of his accomplice. And the only case in which this was accomplished was the 1936 murder of trucker Joseph Rosen. Lepke had squeezed him out of the trucking business, and the man had blurted out somewhere that he would go to the authorities and tell them everything. Once it got to Buchalter, Rosen was dead. Law enforcement managed to find enough witnesses to reconstruct the whole chain of events, from how Lepke gave the order from when the order was carried out. So even Rellis, mysteriously falling out of a window, didn't interfere with the trial. There were enough people there to win the case without him. Buchalter, ever realizing where things were going, refused to make a deal with the authorities. He was twice offered, while the investigation was going on, leniency in exchange for his testimony in the so-called Corporation of Murders case, which originated with Rellis's testimony about contract killings carried out by their gang. Lepke rejected the offers both times. Well, since he did not agree to give something to the authorities, he was tried to the fullest extent of the law, and on November 30th, 1941, Louis Buchalter was sentenced to death. The first and only time in the States an organized crime boss at that level received such a sentence. But if you think the intricacies of the Buchalter story ended there, you're wrong. There was one catch. The drug case, as I said earlier, was a federal case, and the other cases were handled at the state level. So by law, before the death penalty could be carried out, Lepke had to serve 14 years for dealing heroin. The only loophole to get around this was a presidential pardon in the federal case to go straight to the state sentence. However, even here things were not so simple. The president at the time was Democrat Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Thomas Dewey, who had the greatest political ambitions, was a Republican, and that's where big politics came in. Serving time in a federal case, Lepke, to put it crudely, was under the jurisdiction of the president. If Roosevelt pardoned him, Louis would immediately come under the jurisdiction of Dewey, who ruled the ball in New York, first as prosecutor and then as governor. Why is this important, you ask? The fact is that several people strongly close to Roosevelt had business dealings with Buchalter at one time. As an example, Sidney Hillman, as the head of the United Garment Workers Union, worked very close with Lepke, often using his thugs. And Roosevelt was afraid that if he put Buchalter in Dewey's hands, he might try to offer him a deal. He would turn over all the dirty Democratic functionaries and in return receive leniency. If Lepke were to agree to such a deal, it would have been the end of the careers of many subordinates as well as Roosevelt himself, and a dramatic increase in Dewey's political weight. This is why Buchalter's execution was continually postponed for more than 2 years. The authorities found a compromise in this matter only in early 1944, and Louis was transferred to the state of New York. But even there, the law did not stop mocking Lepke. On March 2nd, an execution was scheduled. He was prepared for it and ate his last meal, yet it turned out that because of legal delays, it had to be postponed for 48 hours. So, on March 4th, 1944, he ate his last supper, again. This time, really his last. A couple hours later, he was put in an electric chair. He was electrocuted, and the doctor said, "I pronounce this man officially dead." This was the story of Louis Lepke Buchalter, and as a conclusion to it, I'd like to offer the folk wisdom that states, "You reap what you sow."